to 2021 Postgraduate Research Community Online Conference. The title for this year's conference is Reimagining Possibilities for Educational Research. My name is Preeti Vayada. I am a HDR student and the student representative for the School of Education HDR community. We have an exciting day lined up with remarkable keynote speakers, Professor Kita Takayama, Dr. Mani Shea, and Ms. Danielle Hendricks to start off the session. A warm welcome to all our distinguished guests. But before we start our conference, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I would now like to invite Professor Tisha Morrell, Head of the School of Education, University of Queensland, to formally inaugurate the conference. Thank you, Tisha.
Thank you, Preeti. I too am very excited to welcome you to the University of Queensland School of Education 2021 Postgraduate Research Community Conference. And a big welcome to all of our researchers from other universities. It's great that we can be together to share our work in this manner. I too would like to begin by acknowledging that regardless of where we are physically this morning, we are meeting on custodial lands. And in Australia, the owners are the oldest living civilization in the world. I too pay respects on our behalf to elders, past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to other Indigenous people who are present with us today. We recognize and honor Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, the winds, and the seas, and their rich contributions to society. We are blessed to be here beside them. Given we are still under the cloud of the pandemic, the theme of this year's conference is quite fitting. We have all been reimagining possibilities and examining the potential of educational research to help us remain connected locally and internationally. In education, the pandemic raised issues of equality, increased anxiety, created personal and professional hardships, but it has also made us more aware of how fortunate we are to live in a time when we can easily connect virtually. Universities are not just places of learning and research, but also of safety nets to allow us to communicate with each other about issues of importance to us, both personal and professional. The pandemic has taught us how to teach and learn and research differently. It has made us rethink our educational questions, raise new concerns about teaching and learning, about school leadership, about social justice. It has challenged us, but it has also increased our creativity and flexibility and resiliency. And we will see that coming out in the research that's being shared with us today. Before I close, I would like to again thank all of you for joining us and participating in the conference. And I would like to extend a special thank you to Preeti Vayada, Kim Kong Heng, and Soraya Abdul Hamid for their organizational leadership for the conference, to Professor Takayama for joining us from Kyoto University, as well as Danielle Heinrichs, Maksud Ali, and all the others who have volunteered to review proposals, present keynotes, and lead sessions. Please enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Tisha, for your insightful words and your great support in providing us with this platform to present our work, engage in discussions about research, network, and keep ourselves updated with current research in the educational front. Thank you so much. Associate Professor Ian Hardy is the Director of Research in the School of Education, and his guidance has been immensely useful in all stages of the conference preparation. Ian, it would be a great pleasure for you to formally welcome our distinguished guests, speakers, participants, and the entire postgraduate community present today from the globe. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Preeti. I'd just like to reinforce Tisha's words and Tisha's welcome, etc., to everybody here today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which we're all learning and living today around the world, and recognise the Indigenous peoples who have always lived within those lands, not necessarily with the recognition that they deserve. So it's wonderful, folks, to actually to be in this space and to be able to sort of share one another's experiences from so many different parts of the world. I guess one of the challenges with COVID-19 has been the difficulties of actually coming together physically, but one of the advantages, if we can sort of call it that as such, is that it does provide us with the opportunity to sort of normalise, I guess, relations in some ways in terms of a broader international community. And I think when we look at the presentations today, and as we welcome the addresses from our keynote speakers today, we can see that there's a breadth of knowledge and diversity and sets of experiences from around the world that people are drawing upon, and that our presenters today are themselves situated in different parts of Queensland, Australia and globally. I think that's a reflection of the diversity of our broader research educational community and of the significant work that people are undertaking within this space. So welcome everyone, and we really look forward to people's presentations today. Thanks, Preeti.
Thank you, Ian, for your warm welcome and your inspiring thoughts. Now it's with great pleasure to invite Maqsood, fellow committee member and one of the recipients of CD Memorial Scholarship for 2021, and also Richard Baldock Award 2019. He is the moderator of today's session and will introduce our keynote speakers. Over to you, Maqsood.
Thanks very much, Preeti. So can you hear me, Preeti, right? Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maqsood, and I would like to welcome you all to the keynote session of the conference, Reimagining Possibilities for Educational Research. I know this is one of the key attractions of the conference, and you have been looking forward to this. So thank you very much for joining us today. Dear audience, we live in a globalized world, and we know what it means in terms of interconnectedness. Globalization has not only connected people and nations, but it has also led to the emergence of shared goals, such as United Nations Millennium Development Goals, and currently we have Sustainable Development Goals. These goals, as well as others promoted by the United Nations, OECD, the World Bank, transnational corporations, and importantly, aid agencies, have provided the basis for the construction of a new level vision for development and economic growth. Such a vision, informed by dominant economic logics, has also led to the generalizations of how development works in different societies and contexts. Well, what is important here for us is that these dominant economic logics have come to shape education in our time, again, leading to generalizations of educational models for human capital development. We know about the promotion of PISA, for example, and we also know how global governance in education through this sort of programs has resulted in competition and compromise in what education used to be in terms of social, moral, and community values. Such dominant logics and goals continue to shape educational landscape, even in this critical time of the current pandemic, where inequalities in educational experiences are mounting. And undeniably, it is a difficult time characterized by school closure in different parts of the world, uncertainty of lives, economic recessions, and tensions for early career education researchers in navigating through these challenges. In such a situation, we interrogate the dominant logics and goals, generalized goals and practices, and we also highlight the importance of reimagining possibilities for education research. This includes not only problematizing research practices itself in the first place, but also innovating in alternative lens and practices which are meaningful to different communities. Our three keynote speakers today will be talking through these possibilities of reimagining and or rescoping research with regards to the global, local, and institutional level problems and practices. We have with us today Professor Keita Takayama, Dr. Manishay, and Daniel Heinrichs as keynote speakers. Each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes for their talk. Once we finish the keynotes, there will be time for Q&A. So I would like to request everyone to take notes of their questions and ask them during the Q&A in the end, not immediately after each presentation. So we will start with Keita Takayama. Keita Takayama is a professor and director of Global Education Office at the Graduate School of Education, Kyoto University, Japan. He's also adjunct professor in the School of Education, University of New England, Australia. His research explores globalization of education policy, decolonization of educational research. Many of his publications have appeared in Comparative Education and Comparative Education Review. The title of his talk is "Have Your Critics Gone Far Enough? Reclaiming the Decolonial / Southern Theory Project for International Education and Development." I request Professor Takayama to deliver his keynote speech. Thank you. Professor Takayama, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Excellent.
Yes.
Thanks very much for your kind introduction. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the organizing committee for putting this event together. I know how logistical work could be a nightmare, especially you are making a mistake of inviting an international guest. Very brave of you. So that looks like we don't have any technical problem today, so that's good. And I managed to wake up early in the morning to make this session, so that's also good too. I'm going to share my screen with you all. So as it was mentioned in the introduction, I think UNE jumped me as the affiliate professor of the School of Education there as of last year. So I have to remove that reference to UNE. They only give you 1 year, some sort of affiliated association. And after that, they'll just dump you. So I was at UNE in Australia for about 11.5 years before coming to take up a position in Kyoto, Graduate School of Education, Kyoto University. So that was 2.5 years ago. So it's been that long since I left Australia, and because of COVID, I have not been able to return to Australia, unfortunately. So at the moment, I'm sort of like craving for any opportunity to stay connected with the Australian scholars and institutions. So thanks very much for extending your invitation to me. So today I want to talk about the, I guess in a sense, I want to talk about how some of my work has been taken up. So when you publish a slightly provocative piece, then you would expect some sort of responses, right? And usually you expect some really harsh criticism when you are trying to be a bit provocative. And I certainly have received that. But I also received some more affirming responses. People trying to build up upon your work to extend your work further, which is always pleasing to see. So what I'm going to do today is, instead of trying to critique the criticism of my work, I'm going to critique the people who actually try to build on my work. So that's what I'm going to do today, okay? So in 2017, along with the Arasis Rupakashi, who was in Sydney Uni, now she has moved on to UK, and I think she's with the, no longer with Cambridge, she's with the, I can't remember where, but she's in the UK. And Raymond Cornell, as you know, emeritus professor at the Sydney University, who famously authored a book called Southern Theory, right? So along with two these individuals, I co-edited the special issue Now it's called Blue Cover Special Issue of Comparative Education Review, published out of Chicago University Press. Why is it called Blue Cover? Because it's usually in red. This journal always comes in red, but somehow for the special issue, they put it on a blue cover. So we call that special issue Contesting Coloniality, Rethinking Knowledge Production and Circulation in Comparative and International Education. In a nutshell, we try to expose the Comparative International Education Society, CIES, the founding history's entanglement with the early 20th century US imperialism. So exposing the sort of a production of knowledge and the relationship between the production of knowledge and the US geopolitical interest at the turn of the last century. We also try to challenge the global division of intellectual labor, raising a question as to who actually produces theories and who actually produces the data. So there is clearly a global division of intellectual labor in social sciences and education. So we try to address the hierarchy of knowledges on a global scale and try to reposition the rest of the world, the rest, as an epistemic resource, intellectual resource, and try to decenter the West in knowledge production, as opposed to completely delinking it from it. I think the Western intellectual tradition is important, and yet we need to start decentering it as much as we could. And in terms of the concrete individual that we draw upon, we looked at the Kwansin Chen's work, Asia as Method, and Reverend Cornell's Southern Theory, Walter Mignola's The Dark Side of Western Modernity, and the Linda Smith's work, as you know, from New Zealand, and Gurminder Bambra's work from UK, so-called post-colonial sociology, right? So that's what I did in 2017. And as I mentioned earlier, there has been a fair bit of criticism of the work, just to name a few. I'm not going to go in detail of these criticism of the work, but I just wanted to share those pieces that are quite critical of the special issue. Edward Vickers, who is based in Kyushu University in Japan, is a good friend of mine, but the piece is very scathingly critical, very interesting. And Lim Pin Bu is a historian of Comparative International Education Society, who was also very scathingly critical of my historical work. And the third one, what is comparative education? David Turner, who is based in Beijing Normal University. So these are the criticisms. If you're interested, have a look. So today, I want to talk with the people, or this particular one piece, who try to build on the special issue. I'm going to try and critique it. So in this particular piece, it's called the Pluto Problem, reflexivities of discomfort in teacher professional development. But I just want to say this, by singling this piece out, I don't mean to simply criticize them. I'm trying to use the piece to raise more broader questions about the field, okay? So these two individuals who have been involved in a teacher professional development in Tanzania, in a country East African country. So their task has been introducing so-called learner-centered pedagogy, a constructive pedagogy in an African context. So their work has been funded by World Bank and all those international organizations, right? USAID. So they spent 10 to 25 years working in Tanzanian education, primarily as the agent to introduce learner-centered pedagogy. So being partly influenced by the special issue that I, along with Rafi and the Reverend, put together, they now use the piece to engage in this what they call reflexivities of discomfort. And then they talk about 3 vignettes, 3 stories. This is how they describe the intent of the paper. I'm going to read this lengthy direct quotation. In the following pages, we examine our complicity in promoting an ostensibly universal pedagogical approach, that is child-centered pedagogy, right? Learner-centered pedagogy, without engaging sufficiently with the alternative epistemological claims. I want to emphasize this phrase here. Without sufficiently engaging with the alternative epistemological claims made and held by Tanzanian teachers. Our interest is not in discerning whether the teachers are drawing on pre-colonial indigenous views of education, as some post-colonial scholars seek to eliminate. And you see my name, so this reference to the special issue, right? I'm not quite sure if I'm actually claiming that we need to go back to the pre-colonial history or views of education, but let's put that aside for now. Rather, our concern lies in interrogating our own certainty about learner-centered pedagogy as synonymous with good teaching based upon constructivist, child-centered truth, and how this conviction may have inhibited our ability to appreciate the distinctly different views about knowledge and intergenerational hierarchies expressed and demonstrated by many of the teachers in the program. So they're quite explicit about the intent of the paper. This is a really reflective piece. They're trying to revisit what they've done and how their work was responded by the Tanzanian teachers, right? Drawing upon post-colonial, decolonial work. So they provide 3 vignettes, but I'm gonna just talk about 2 of the 3. So in this vignette, they talk about building on students' prior knowledge. So they're running this workshop and they try to introduce this constructive pedagogy, right? And then they're trying to emphasize the importance of, how teacher needs to build upon what students already know. And here's a response from one of the Tanzanian workshop participants. If you ask students what they already know about a topic, they'll think you don't know about the topic yourself. So basically the participant is saying, that's silly. As a teacher, why would you ask that kind of question? You're supposed to know everything that the students should know, right? What's the point of trying to uncover what students have already known? So the authors talk about a number of examples like that where their attempt to introduce learner-centered pedagogy was constantly questioned, contested, and rejected. And they say, we realized that there was an epistemological difference about what constitutes knowledge, evident in the teacher's frequent objection to this kind of knowledge elicitation. Okay, so that's vignette 1, 2, 3. Let's move on to 3. Now, then they, in the 3rd story, they talk about the experience of introducing what they call essential questions. So this is supposed to be a very important strategies to create child-centered learning, learner-centered learning environment, right? So essential questions are supposed to be open-ended, thought-provoking, intellectually engaging. It raises additional questions and requires support and justification, not just an answer. All this high-order thinking stuff. So they were trying to get the participant to come up with essential questions, right? But then what happened was that all these Tanzanian teachers, despite their effort to introduce these essential questions, they all come up with definitional questions. And then they say, in short, what seems essential to our Tanzanian colleagues was an essential question was that it could be taught and directly and recalled precisely by students. So they don't really accept or understand this essential question stuff at all. So they, the Tanzanian teachers and the teacher educators, modified universal approaches, that is the learner-centered approaches, and a method aimed at promoting certain kinds of knowledge production and dissemination to make them consistent with the forms of knowledge they value, especially the teaching of discrete definitions and facts. So this learner-centered pedagogy they're trying hard to introduce was completely modified by the Tanzanian teachers. And then they talk about why this was the case, right? So they say the main concern of the Tanzanian teachers may have been to effectively prepare students for an examination with close-ended items, rather than to cultivate the so-called higher order thinking skills. So to me, they're talking about this examination system, which was introduced by the colonial power, and it continued on after that, after the independence in 1963. And then they also say, moreover, the pedagogical approaches the Tanzanian teachers use reflected their experiences as students themselves. So because they grew up in the system where factual recall was emphasized, and that was the bottom line in education system, it's very difficult for them to make a switch from that to learner-centered pedagogy, it seems to be implying. And in fact, if you look around, there are other studies that also looked at the implementation problems of learner-centered pedagogies in the global south, namely Sriprakash's work, Vavras, Schweisfurth, 2011. All these works seems to identify the particular institutional context, that is high-stake testing, the colonial legacy, and also lack of resource, overcrowded classrooms and so forth, lack of teacher resources for learner-centered pedagogy implementation failure in the developing countries. So all these studies seems to suggest that learner-centered pedagogy requires a particular institutional and cultural conditions, right? But then the question is, didn't they talk about epistemology, alternative epistemology earlier in their piece? So the question to me is, so what are the alternative theory of learning? Or what are the alternative theory of knowledge that the Tanzanian teachers are drawing upon in order to resist or in order to recontextualize learner-centered pedagogy? To me, that is missing in the piece. So what is the alternative epistemology? What about the Tanzanian teachers' Tanzanian intellectual tradition and culture and history? Don't they somehow inadvertently present Tanzanian teachers as someone without a theory of knowledge and learning? And don't they somehow inadvertently present—
I'm listening, but I'm not.
Don't they somehow present Tanzanian teachers as a helpless victim of the past colonialism, I wonder? So is it okay to say that, assume that the teacher-centered pedagogy is a colonial institutional legacy? Isn't there any other way to account for the popularity or pedagogical effectiveness of teacher-centered pedagogy in the world? So to me, without articulating alternative epistemology or theory of learning, the critique of learner-centered pedagogy as best practice as promoted by World Bank and OECD remains grossly insufficient. So what are the alternatives? To me, this piece, Hikaru Komatsu and Jeremy Rapley, Jeremy Rapley is a colleague of mine in Kyoto University. Hikaru has moved on to Taiwanese National University. But this piece does a really interesting job, a PISA paradox, alternative theory of learning as a possible solution for variations in PISA scores. So in this piece, they talk about what they call type 2 learning. That is basically a teacher-centered pedagogy. But they use the term type 2 learning as opposed to learner-centered pedagogy. And they talk about teaching and learning in East Asia, especially in Japan. And they do an extensive review of the Japanese philosophy and history and culture. They look into the pre-modern schooling, Terakoya and Hanko. Terakoya is the temple schools for commoners, and Hanko is the schools for samurai warriors. So type 2 learning, according to them, requires the students' trust in their teachers, which in turn leads to obedience to the teacher's guidance and persistence in the task assigned by the teacher, and deference for what the teacher is trying to communicate, even if not immediately understood, okay? So they goes on type 2 learning, basically learning without understanding the meaning of the content, is the only way to bring about a change in students' frame. So the key word here is the change in the frame of the students. So type 2 learning is possible when a student faces something that he finds neither understandable nor interesting, and yet brackets her existing frame while continuing to struggle long enough until the frame itself disintegrates or change. A type 2 learning thus requires enforcement and or guidance, either explicit or implicit, by a teacher or equivalent others as an essential factor for making such learning possible. So you begin to see the alternative theory of knowledge and learning as might be underpinning teacher-centered pedagogy from their discussion. So just to conclude, they present type 2 learning or teacher-centered pedagogy as a kind of ontopedagogy. That is, this learning is deeply about ontology. That is the change in the self. Learning self constantly molded and remolded. And in so doing, it rejects the innate fixed selfhood in type 1. That is a more learner-centered pedagogy. So learning is about changing one's frame through teacher imposition. So learning never ends. It's about continual self-overcoming. That's the term that they use. It's about self-overcoming. So teacher-centered pedagogy in Japan is an ontopedagogy. So to me, unless you actually try to dig into the philosophy of the way in which teacher-centered pedagogy is articulated in a particular national context, say Tanzania, you're not really doing enough of decolonial or Southern theory work in educational development. Thanks very much. I might have gone over time, sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Takayama. This was really amazing. I'm sure the audience has enjoyed it. Okay, now it's time for the next talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Mani Shea. Dr. Mani Shea is an ARCD-AAT SIA Senior Research Fellow in the School of Education. Dr. Shea has an extensive research program that spans the fields of Indigenous education and policy, flexi schooling, and youth studies, and she published in a wide range of journals, books, and scholarly media outlets. With colleagues Professor Rhonda Oliver, she edited a key text in the field of Indigenous education entitled Indigenous Education in Australia, Learning and Teaching for Deadly Futures. That was published by Routledge. The book won a national award for tertiary/vet teaching and learning resources, wholly Australian category at the Education Publishing Awards Australia. Dr. Shea's research has demonstrated a strong impact on policy and practice in her fields, and she has contributed to numerous policy submissions, non-traditional research outputs such as podcasts and school reviews. Dr. Shea's excellent research contributions were recognized this week, and she was awarded a UQ Research Foundation Research Excellence Award 2021. Congratulations, Mani. And the talk of Mani's the title of Mani's talk is Unproblematizing Research, Reimagining Education Research Through a Strengths-Based Lens. Thank you. Mani, over to you.
Thanks, Maksud. Before I get started, I too would like to acknowledge country and acknowledge the lands on which we're all zooming in from today. I'm on Yarrapul country, so I'm at home west of Ipswich in the Lockyer Valley area this morning. And I'd like to acknowledge this country and the extensive history that's been touched upon this morning, the some 65,000 years that our people have had in connection to country, and I guess the role that that our people have had as researchers, the first researchers of this country. And I'm very, very proud of having, having that connection through my family. So I'd like to introduce myself in terms of my culture and my cultural identities. So on my mum's side, my people are from the Daly River region in the Northern Territory. So that's Wagaman country of the Nungameri language group. I was born in Brisbane and raised around southeast Queensland by mum. And so I'm very fortunate to have many community connections around southeast Queensland, and an appreciation of the deep and rich knowledges that exist in our community that have been pushed out of settings like universities. So is it the problem with, is it the research problem or the problem with research? Research is inherently a problem-based endeavour. So increasingly there is a need to justify rigorous research-based inquiry over looking at other ways of addressing what is perceived to be research problems. So common views of social science research is overwhelmingly explanation-oriented, where the central question is why. Common answers to why research a topic include intellectual curiosity, because the topic is of significance or it's a persistent issue, or simply because it's a hot topic. So my talk today is probably going to pick up on the wonderful presentation from Professor Takayama, in that I'm picking up on ideas of decentering the West and addressing hierarchies of knowledge, and you'll see that as the presentation progresses. So I'm looking, I really wanted to unpack how are problems constructed and by whom. So Professor David Silverman cautions researchers about how particular problems are constructed via the media and or political agendas. We know the impact of the media in identifying and representing issues in schooling and education more broadly. It is common for reporting via the media and or political commentary on issues such as curriculum, teachers and educational policy, for example, to impact on the ways in which problems in schooling and education are identified. And I think we would all be familiar with that here in Australia and more abroad. So the notion of problems for minorities in particular in research has been a source of the reproduction of oppression. And that's not a radical statement. That's something that many theorists and education scholars have talked about for a long time. So some social researchers have built their careers and generated thousands of journal articles and books. But how has this been of benefit to those subjects of the research? We must think critically about what types of knowledges are produced and for whom do they benefit. How problems are perceived, conceptualized, and located is very dependent on the lens of the researcher. What is their social, cultural, racial, economic, historical relationship to the problem? My problem with problems. So my journey into research told me very early on that there is a problem, in particular with the ways in which my people, Aboriginal people, are represented in education scholarship. So I should have introduced myself in earlier slides, but my background is as a youth worker, as a teacher, a classroom teacher in flexi schools. So they're schools for young people who've been disenfranchised from education. And so obviously being Aboriginal and being raised in my culture, I have a particular lens that I'm bringing when I'm reading scholarship about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education in Australia. And when I started, I found that most of it was written by non-Indigenous people, and I found a lot of what I was reading quite jarring. I read about gaps, I read about deficits, I read about problems to fix, and it often didn't reflect my lived experiences or my professional experiences working in education that would be labelled at the margins in flexi schools. Strengths approaches. Is it a practice framework or can it be more? So Salibi discusses a general cultural fixation on psychopathology, victimization, abnormality, and moral and interpersonal aberrations, underlying a broader fascination in our society with problems. The language of strengths is scant in contrast to the language of problems. Is academia then a breeding ground for knowledge production that reinforces these problematizing cultural norms? McCashin defines strengths approaches as a philosophical approach aimed at bringing about change. So this philosophical approach emphasizes people's capacities, dignities, rights, uniqueness, and agency. And I would add humanity to that too. It aims to address personal, social, cultural, and structural constraints in a person's or group's growth and self-determination. It creates enabling conditions to identify and mobilize their strengths and capacities. So what does this mean for research? And I will just pause and say that strengths approaches have had a really big impact on my work as a practitioner, as an educator, and as a youth worker. But I would say that philosophy really followed me into my work as a researcher. Emphasis on problems in justifying the rationale for research and institutional limitations placed upon researchers means incorporating these principles in an academic or research setting can be challenging. But what I wanted to do today is just share one example of one project. I think it influences most of my work, most of my scholarship, but I wanted to share one example today in the short time that I have, because it has been heavily shaped through a strengths-based lens. So on a project called Excellence in Indigenous Education, with my good colleagues, Dr. Jody Miller and Dr. Soraya Abdul Hamid, we are exploring what excellence in Indigenous education is or could be. As I saw the term Black excellence being used in my community over a really long period of time and in so many different contexts, I began to think about the field of Indigenous education and why the only language I read about in policy, in scholarship and practice seemed to be about gaps to close and problems to solve. A simple Google search of excellence and Indigenous education rendered very limited results. We commenced a pilot study with 3 secondary schools in Queensland, originally funded by the UQ ECR scheme, and we've since secured further funding from Edmund Rice Education Australia to work with a further 12 schools in Queensland. Our aims are to create a data set that maps perspectives, understandings, and experiences of Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators and leaders. We asked questions that explored how excellence was defined by individuals, how a practice of excellence in Indigenous education was conceptualized, and what were some examples from the schools. We deliberately center the voices of Indigenous people in the study. We position Indigenous people as excellent. We shift the focus in the study from Indigenous people to the provision of education in terms of Indigenous education and all that it encompasses. We purposefully and intently seek out examples of where educators and school leaders and Indigenous community members saw excellence as they defined it occurring in their school or community setting. Now, I apologise for the wordiness of my slides today, but I was still mapping out my ideas. These ideas I'm presenting today are a work in progress. But what I wanted to demonstrate is the idea of bringing a strengths lens to research isn't simply applying a couple of philosophical ideas. It actually should shape the entire research design in my eyes. So what I've done is mapped some of the strengths principles that I originally set out. And I just wanted to show how it has informed our entire research design on this particular work. So in emphasizing capacities, dignities, rights, uniqueness, and agency, when we were conceptualizing the research and also shaping the research questions, we conceptualize it through Indigenous lenses. We reject focusing on closing the gap failure to a reimagining of Indigenous education through a discourse of excellence. It was very deliberate. And we also centre the voices of Indigenous people. In terms of theories, you should think, if you like the idea of applying strengths approaches to your research, the use of critical and transformational theories is foundational to that approach. This particular project that we're working on is informed by Indigenous theory, so educational scholar Professor Lester Irabina-Rigney, and anti-colonial discursive theory as well. But I would say, you know, we're clearly drawing on ideas from Ferrer and others. You can see that coming through. But the use of theory is very important, or critical and transformational theories is very important. Fit for purpose methodologies and methods. So if we're using methods that don't allow for Indigenous people and voices and agency, then we're not really staying true to a strengths approach in terms of the research design. So we're using a methodology called collaborative yarning methodology that I developed over some years. And what it does is it's centering an Indigenous ontology and an Indigenous method for sharing knowledges and creating a space that enables Indigenous people to participate in culturally safe and relevant ways. But it also has a mechanism within data collection to enable Indigenous people to see what data is being collected and have agency in what data is being collected in the field. And so that might extend to going back to people afterwards, but it's a long process of collecting data, but it's a rigorous one, and it's one that centres Indigenous agency. In terms of analysis and findings, as I said, collaborative yarning methodology embeds analysis with our research partners during data collection, and we're also regularly feeding back to community and back to schools. Finally, in terms of what we do with the data, we're not just doing the traditional publishing in high-ranking peer-reviewed journals. We are doing that because that's critical and that's important, and that's what makes it research. It's what adds the rigour to the scholarship. But in addition to that, we're also doing a lot of non-traditional research outputs. So it includes a video series, for example, where we're creating a professional development video series for these schools that is going to be used for professional development, for staff inductions, and for other educational purposes. We've also got a website under development, because what we'd like to do is to be able to share our findings relatively quickly, and also have a central place where people can come to find out how the data is emerging. We also write in professional magazines, and we do formal and informal presentations, and we also feed back to key policy settings, and that's quite strategic. So all of that takes quite a lot of extra work in terms of, you know, your typical approach to research, but to us, that's the foundation of strengths approaches, because it's enabling that, change to occur, which is one of the key principles of strengths approaches. So my reflections so far, I think that a strengths lens can be a powerful way of reframing perceived problems. There is a growing body of research, mostly in the social work scholarship, that use elements of strengths approaches, and most use strengths principles in their research design, but they don't necessarily report on whether approaching the research in this way has rendered some of the outlined benefits in the philosophy that I outlined earlier. So I think there's a space to grow understanding of how a strengths approach might impact long term. We have observed the power of shifting language to inquire about what is essentially the same issue, because it prompts people to think differently. Some of the critiques of strengths approaches is that, you know, if we're not naming disadvantage, if we're not calling it out, how do we actually address it? We know that it's more than a smiley face emoji. It's really about centering social wealth and human capital. And it's a very complex and very time-consuming way of approaching research, but it's something that I want to invest my time in. And I'm not proposing that this is a panacea to pervasive social justice issues. I want to make that really clear. But I am suggesting that the existing body of scholarship tells us very clearly that we need new ways of looking at complex issues. I've been developing and applying these ideas in my practice and scholarship over many, many years now. I've been writing a paper where I've been attempting to theorize some of these ideas to inform research intended for social policy and practice impact. And I'm obviously drawing from theorists like Lester Irabina-Rigny, Ferrer, and methodologies like appreciative inquiry. But I'm taking my time with this work because it's slow thinking and it's important thinking in terms of my experience in applying it as a researcher. So that's it from me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mani, for your excellent presentation. We now have Danielle Henriks. She is the final speaker. Danielle Henriks is a final year PhD candidate in the School of Education at UQ, researching language education, social media, and decoloniality. She became a senior fellow for Higher Education Academy in 2020 and was awarded the Richard Boldoff Memorial Prize for her journal article exploring critical discourse analysis and Spanish. She recently published in Critical Inquiry in Language Studies using New Materialism, and has an interest in the intersection of language policy, health/digital literacy, global education. She is experienced in tutoring and lecturing in Indigenous education and sociology for pre-service and international students, and is a trained secondary teacher of Spanish, German, and TESOL. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Maksud, and also thank you to everyone for the invite to the conference today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's equally as exciting and daunting to be presenting after Mani and Professor Takayama. So thank you both also for your presentations. Today, my topic is looking at unpuzzling problems as opportunities, so reimagining early career researcher pathways, and I do definitely include PhD students in this group of early career researchers as well. I know there are quite a few of us who are at the end of our PhD studies, maybe have submitted, but as well there are a lot of us who are, or a lot of you who might be a bit newer to the whole PhD study. So I'm hoping there is something for everyone in here. My talk is a little bit more informal. It's more a mixture of my advice and my experiences throughout my candidature. So hopefully you can take something away from this today. As Mani did before, I did also want to include a little bit about myself. Maksud has included a very nice summary there. So my area that I really research is language education. I'm a heritage speaker of German and Spanish, so family background in that. My teaching areas are languages other than English and English as well. And more I've been trying to develop myself as an interdisciplinary researcher, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. And I've had some surprising areas emerge from that. I think education, sociolinguistics, and Indigenous knowledges, they're all things that make sense for someone in the Australian context doing languages, but the area of public health is something I never imagined that I would be researching, but I guess isn't so surprising when you consider the COVID context. I would also like to just mention and acknowledge the land from which I'm presenting and learning from today, the Yagara of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. And acknowledge that this is unceded land, and also the land which I grew up on, which is down in Sydney. So that is Turrbal country of the Jurag people as well. So what will I be covering? There are a few pieces of the puzzle that I think we're always struggling to put together as PhD students. So I'll quickly talk about some of the recurrent problems, things that I've seen from my own experience, and of course, being a PhD student, I've obviously gone and had a look at the literature to see what's in there. But the majority of what I'll talk about today are some things I think that we can use as opportunities. So ways we can open doors for ourselves, with transdisciplinary practices as well as intersectoral practices. And then I will touch on something that is hard to avoid talking about, and that's the issue of immobility. So I've got a really nice concept that I'll talk about called hospicing, and then I'll just talk about some more practical things around rescoping. I think it's always a good idea to have some backup ideas for your projects up your sleeve as well. So I'll talk about that too. So these are some of the recurrent problems I think that as PhD candidates we are dealing with. Publications. I don't think there's been a meeting during my time as a PhD student where I haven't heard one student, at least one student say, I'm worried about publishing. This whole publish or perish issue is there. So we can't really ignore that. But certainly other things like insecure employment, we know there's the increased casualisation of the field, and that's something that PhD students in my experience and the literature are worried about, as well as this issue of unpaid positions and unpaid work. There is a really interesting paper that I've included there by Fernandez, Bellon and Kane, where they problematize that. I'm not sure I 100% agree with the whole critique of doing some unpaid work as a PhD student. I think unfortunately we kind of need to do it to build our CVs, but certainly if you're engaging with unpaid work and you want to have a bit more of a think about it, you might like to read that paper. And another issue that we know from the literature, and I'm sure from experience, is mental health can be a big issue. So that is something that we do need to be cognizant of. And certainly some of these things here, whilst they have been issues for a long time, I think they have been exacerbated by the pandemic and what's going on at the moment. I would like to focus on a particular thing that came up in the research. So this was a particular problem that was highlighted by a group of, I assume, PhD candidates down at Sydney Uni. So they asked the students what, how they had been impacted, and particularly around work and finance. So you can see here that from this research from last year, around 70% of PhD students had lost income, and therefore that issue of financial stress is something I think we do need to also bear in mind that has come out of the pandemic for PhD students in particular. They're losing work, they're losing money, so they're quite stressed about a few of these things there. Some of the other issues that have come out, and these are probably the ones I'll more be focusing on addressing today, because unfortunately I can't hand out money to people, are the issues around ambiguous identities, so really not knowing who we are as researchers. And that could be due to over-specialisation or feeling like we have a lack of transferable skills. That's something I can definitely relate to. Being in Queensland, we only have 2 universities that really offer pre-service language teacher education. So for me, that's such a niche area. It's so tiny, and it's been quite stressful to think about the fact that in the context of COVID, what am I going to do if I can't get a job in that? I need to have other options because that is such a niche and specialised field. Obviously, just the general pandemic and being worried about health, childcare responsibilities are a big issue, as well as having just unclear future directions. So bearing those particular contextual issues in mind, I will sort of give some tips and advice for how I think we can address that with some examples from my own experience. So I guess 2 of the biggest things that I've been trying to work on are related to transdisciplinarity and intersectorality. So these are terms from the research. And I was reading a paper by Lawless, and they talk about undisciplinary training. And I thought that was a really nice concept. So if you're, for example, someone who does a lot of quantitative work and looking at qualitative approaches, and if you're qualitative, looking at quantitative approaches, trying to actually learn, I guess, almost the opposite of what you've been trained to do. I think that's also a good way to think about it as a PhD student, because often I think we get stuck in learning one thing because we're doing what's in our thesis and we might be publishing just that, and we come out and we're experts in one thing. So considering how you might be able to do some undisciplinary training is a really nice way to also add something else to your list of skills that you'll have when you graduate. And I guess one of the difficulties is, how do you do that? I know we're all so busy and it's a lot of learning that's going on just for your thesis, but some things that I found really helpful are trying to publish really early on, but with the goal of trying to use a different methodology in that publication. So one of the first papers that I did actually uses new materialism and a diffractive analysis, and that's not what's in my thesis. My thesis is using critical discourse analysis and decoloniality. So Actually, when I graduate, though, I'll have 2 different things that I can show that I've been able to do. So if you can look at even some of the data from your PhD, I know that you probably can't do that early on, but using it differently and maybe publishing it with a different methodology, that can be a good way to do it. Or maybe you have some side projects, maybe it's RA work with supervisor if they have it, or maybe you'll create your own side project. I think I've taken that off my list there, but there was also the concept of having our own agency and engaging in things and taking the initiative to do that. And I think that is really important. If not everyone's supervisors are going to have RA work for various reasons. So you can always see if there's a way you might be able to create a little project for yourself, and it might just be a paper with some other students. I've been really lucky that I was able to network with people at conferences back when they were face-to-face and do some work with virtual linguistic landscape as the methodology. I did a research placement where I did a systematic literature review, which for me is like the antithesis of what I've been doing. I've been doing almost some post-qualitative stuff. So to do something as structured as a systematic literature review was very undisciplinary for me. I would also encourage you to check out and keep an eye out for winter and summer schools. I was lucky enough to attend the QUT Digital Media Research Summer School this year, and I've included some links on the final slide for this, which I did mean to share the link for my presentation, so I'll make sure I share that at the end so that you can access that. But that was a really great way to learn about some other undisciplinary practices. There were a lot of journalists, students doing journalism at that at that summer school, and certainly even just the conversations I had with them around the ethics of doing research were, I'm sure you can imagine, very different to how I think about ethics of doing research in education. But being a digital media summer school, they also talked about how to use big data. So that's not something I've done. My data collection for my PhD is a really tiny, I guess in the scheme of things, like a really tiny group of people that I spoke with. So big data was not something I'd engaged with, and I was able to learn about some of the methods for doing that. So I would highly encourage you to look at winter and summer schools. A lot of them are free. The QT one is free. I don't know if it'll be running again on campus next year, but certainly the link is there so you can check it out. And I've included a link to Linguist List, which if you're in the area of language education or even literacy or English, that might be of interest. And then there's one for a bunch of them that run out of Europe. So I think they'll be online. So certainly have a look at that. Another tip I have is attending non-education conferences. So I think most of us we're kind of between at least 2 places because we have our curriculum focus. So if maybe you're a science teacher or a maths teacher, maybe attending some conferences that are more specific to just that area. I attended a cultural studies conference, and that was really great because it had just so many methods and so many different topics that I was able to learn about. And that's actually what saved my PhD when I had to rescope it last year. I had learned about a really great method for doing research from the cultural studies conference from an honours student from Griffith. So I probably need to send her an email once I graduate and say thank you for saving my thesis. But I think that going to those non-education conferences can be a really good way to just build up your knowledge of different methods and methodologies. I think it goes without saying, and it's in the research, that networking at conferences is a really good idea, as well as collaborating with supervisors if you've got the opportunity to do that. Probably something I found the most interesting out of the research, and upon reflection realized I had been doing, I just didn't plan it, is getting non-supervisory support. So that could be with someone else in your school. As a mentor, I've been so lucky that Dr. Soraya Hamid, who's here today, has been an absolutely fantastic mentor for me on top of what I've been getting from my supervisors. So that's been really great, and I would highly encourage you to seek out anyone else in your own schools that can offer that. But something else really interesting from the Lenniston and Mountford paper was getting mentorship from industry professionals. So I've had some experience recently with doing a lot of job applications, and something that we're constantly being asked about, even when applying for level B roles, is the industry connections that we have. So if you think of it this way, having a mentor who's from industry throughout your PhD is actually a great way not only to make sure that you're learning and learning about things beyond the academy, but it is something that is coming up in job applications. And for me, that's always been the hardest question to answer as well. So I think it sort of serves 2 purposes there, and I would highly encourage people to think about doing that. And then there's this concept of sense giving. Sounds kind of complicated, but it's really just about taking some information you already have and presenting it in a new way. So that's something I tried to do with some of my PhD data presenting it in my thesis with one methodology and in a paper in a different way. So, you know, you don't have to necessarily go out and get new things. You might just be working with the same thing in different ways. And I think that's probably a more practical way to do things also. There is also a really nice paper. This was published before COVID, so maybe not all of this is doable at the moment, but I thought this paper by Bridle from 2018 had a nice summary of different ideas as well for how you can engage in transdisciplinary or even intersectoral work. And it was around building teams for specific calls. And that's something I've had great success with recently. So keeping an eye out, it could be for calls for papers or conferences, and seeing what the topics are. And if it's not something that you feel like you are an expert on individually, seeing if you can build a team around that. So the way I've done that recently is I was invited to contribute to a special issue of a journal that talked about refugee language education. So whilst I do language education, refugee language education is not necessarily something that I feel super confident in, but I was able to build a really great team with a scholar who's got lived experience of the refugee life in Australia and language. And also theoretically, we wanted to make sure in that proposal that we were using an appropriate theory. I didn't feel confident with the theory. It was refugee crit, which is related to critical race theory, but I was able to find someone to work with who's really great with the theory. So together, we were able to build a really great team for this specific call. So I think that's just something else to bear in mind. It can be a really good way to start working with people that you might have been wanting to work with them, or you hadn't thought of working with them. It's a good way to think about bringing people together as well. So I guess the other issue that we really can't avoid talking about at the moment is immobility. We're all unable to travel. I guess Professor Takayama is showing us that because he's presenting from quite far away. We're all in our homes as well today. And I suppose there's two things here. There's the international side of that, where there are tons of options out there around presenting online and all the digital solutions, but I just thought I would throw a bit of a spanner in the works and include something that my secondary supervisor had recently published on, and this was the notion of hospicing. And essentially it was, you can see from the quote here, it's around disinventing ourselves from the promises of mobility and letting go of our attachment to it. So it doesn't really offer a solution for it. It's more about changing how we think about it, and maybe just staying with the trouble of not being able to move around at the moment, and trying to resist the urge to solve that problem, because it is quite stressful when we get too stuck into it. And it's a really great paper that goes into much more detail than I have time to talk about here today. But I thought at least that's another way of thinking about this idea of mobility. Maybe we don't need to rush to solve it. Maybe we just enjoy this time of not being able to move around, because in their paper they do go through a lot of the problems that are associated with doing that. On the flip side, I realized that at least in our local contexts, many of us do need to move around for research purposes, to conduct field work. And if you need some ideas for different ways to do that, there are some fantastic guides. So Deborah Lupton started a guide last year, and that's crowdsourced. It's fantastic. It has a lot of ideas in it. And Garcia and Barclay have really picked up on that, and it created an even more detailed guide. So there's lots of ideas in there. I've listed a couple on the screen for you. So just to sort of piece it all together, how do we bring all these puzzle pieces together? Some really practical suggestions. Marnie touched on in her presentation this idea of non-traditional outputs, and that's where I got my idea from. There's a little link even to a conversation article that she wrote with Beth Madsen, who's another PhD student. So I think some of those things can be really helpful. As I mentioned, side projects, even doing grant applications. There are some really small ones that PhD students can do. You'll need to check your different universities for what's available, but you know, we can all do the Fulbright application. If you don't know what that is, go check that out. The Universitas 21, I think most of the universities in Australia are part of that, but just go check. I know we've got people from lots of unis here. Doing an industry placement, that's an option at UQ. Again, you'll have to check the other universities. I did mine at the CSIRO, working on social and cultural norms around water management and trying to tell hydro engineers why we need to talk about water ontologies. That was a big learning curve for me. If you haven't also thought about maybe doing your HEA application, so that's the Higher Education Academy out of the UK, I think they're now called Advanced Higher Education. I've included a link there that you can look up for UQ as well as their official site if you're from another university, but basically it's just recognition that you know how to teach in the university space. And that would be another piece of advice I'd give you. And I put that picture of the salt there just to remind myself that please take my advice with a grain of salt. Talk to your supervisors. They will definitely have other specific advice. This has just come from what I've experienced and what I've seen, but hopefully it's been helpful. And I just wanted to leave with a quote from one of my favourite scholars, Donna Haraway. So she talks about this idea of symbiosis, and she says it's a simple word. It means making with, even though it sounds like a complex word. She says nothing makes itself, nothing is really auto-poetic or self-organising. And I think certainly as early career researchers, when we're trying to unpuzzle everything, that is the case. We do need to be collaborating, working with others, working with other disciplines and doing things a bit differently to future-proof ourselves, particularly in the context of COVID. So I'll leave you with that very complicated but apparently simple word. That is all from me. I will share a link for my presentation, as I've got the summer schools linked there as well, and everything else linked in here in case you'd like to access that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Danny. It's a really hard time for many HDR students in many ways. So I'm sure this will be, your insights will be useful for many of the HDR students. Thank you very much. Looks like now we can move towards the Q&A session. We have quite a few questions for Professor Takayama. We have one question from Roberto. What are the limits and possibilities when critiquing your colleagues, mentors, or examiners' work? Any suggestion about it for PhD students when writing their PhD thesis?
Do you want me to answer now?
Yes, please.
I guess it doesn't have to be me to answer the question, but I guess my answer to that would be very simple. No limits.
Okay.
Hey, no limits. Come on. What are you talking about? I mean,
Okay.
it's as long as it's done in a proper, appropriate, I guess, diplomatic way, any critique should be accepted. So I have absolutely no hesitation when I was a graduate student, critiquing my own professor, Michael Apple. He was very generous and willing to accept my critique. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, somebody has just suggested just to be honest in what we do. All right, so we have a question from Professor Tisha. She has thanked you, and so her question is type 1 and type 2, a way of looking at constructivism versus behaviorism.
The distinction between type 1 and type 2, I mean, it's I don't want to represent Komatsu and Rapley's argument. I think it's best for you to have a look at the piece, but just to quickly summarize what they are trying to get to, I think they're trying to get to the different ontological assumptions between type A and type D. In type A, what they mean by that is a child-centered learning, and type 2 is a learner-centered learning. And the kind of assumption that people make about the learner's self in the process of learning, what happened to the notion of self, right? In the type 1 learning, in the child-centered learning, because the teacher tried to organize learning processes around what students are interested in, right? So there's a tendency that the students will end up staying within the frame that is based upon the student's original interest, right? So the students who acquire knowledge within the frame that is already set up by the students themselves. But so that there's little space for self-overcoming in that learning. But they would argue that in type 2 learning, because students are required to accept a degree of imposition by the teachers who is, supposedly know how learning should take place and what students should learn. So there is more coercion involved. And then student learning is not necessarily centered around what students are originally interested in. It's more organized around what teachers think the students should learn, right? Sometimes what teachers offer might be incomprehensible not immediately pleasurable, understandable. Yet the students are expected to persist and persevere until they get to realize what it was all about, right? So then that process more involves self-overcoming, because they have to sort of renounce whatever the original frame that you were within, you stayed within, in order to appreciate and understand what the teacher was trying to do to you. So it involves more self-transformation, changes in yourself as a learner. So what they're trying to highlight again is the sort of different ontological assumptions embedded in type 1 and type 2 learning.
Thank you. I think there is a note from Marnie. Roberto, you can also take a look at that as well. Marnie, would you like to say a few words on that?
I'm happy not to interrupt.
Right.
Yeah, I can if you like. Would you like me to, Max?
Yeah, just maybe a few words. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think, you know, the heart of academia is critique and debating ideas, of course. But I would also add that it's not a racially or gender neutral space that we occupy. And therefore, if you're not part of the majority or the people that hold the most power, or the gender that holds the most power, or the race that holds the most power, I think that it's a difficult thing to say, you know, go to town with critiquing other people's work. And I can say that from sitting in a room with non-Indigenous professors of Indigenous education and being the Aboriginal person sitting in the room and questioning things. So there are consequences to it if you're not part of the majority. And I have to be really frank about that.
Thanks, Marnie. Kit, I guess I have one more question for you from Stephen. Are there other examples of the kind of decolonizing work you agreed for?
Other examples?
Yep. If you look around nowadays, I think the term decolonial is everywhere, which is kind of encouraging. But at the same time, you see a strong pushback coming from
to give a quick answer.
Some corners. But I see that it's. I mean, depending upon what do you mean by decolonial work, and certainly the kind of work that Marnie just mentioned today is decolonial. It draws upon decolonial framing. Linda Smith's work, for example. So there are plenty other examples. There's too many to talk about. But I think it's also important, as I said in the presentation, that some of the decolonial work, in my mind, haven't gone far enough, in my view. If you are serious about recognizing the rest of the world as the epistemic resource, then I think you really have to look deeply into the context, intellectual work that's generated in that context, history and philosophy, in order to understand why certain best practice pedagogies are recontextualized and rejected and so forth. And I want to, in saying this response, I want to go back I want to answer some of the questions that was raised, which I thought was interesting. I think the question was basically that many of the African countries were so thoroughly colonized that therefore, unlike Japan, which was a colonizer, therefore, they were able to maintain their philosophy and history, so they were able to develop their own pedagogical theory. But in contrast to that, African countries were so decimated by colonial legacy, and therefore they've got none. I mean, I'm exaggerating the question a bit, but I think that was the gist of the question that was raised. So in response to that, I don't accept that. I would not accept that premise at all. Look at what Marnie did today. Indigenous folks were thoroughly colonized in the white settler country, and look what's happening. They were able to maintain and develop and extend their ideas and worldviews and philosophy. And I'm not quite sure why can we expect something similar from African context. And if you look around, all the anthropological work and African philosophical work, it's there. We're not paying enough attention, I think.
Thanks, Takayama. So there are two more interesting questions. Maybe if you can very quickly answer these two questions, we are also running out of time. But the first question is here: what is the one message or big idea you want people to take away from your rich presentation today?
Is this for me or for everyone?
For you, actually.
Oh, come on, I've spoken too much.
Okay. So we'll go to the next one. In that case, how do you distinguish what is colonial or local epistemology?
How do we distinguish?
Yep.
Oh, I don't know, to be honest. But I think it's all these challenges that you would anticipate once you get into the philosophy of the Tanzanian intellectuals and so forth, right? Yes, you will eventually run into that problem of how do we distinguish? But I think unless we actually do it, but to me, the impression that I have seen after seeing all this work, international development work in education coming out of Tanzania, there are quite a few. None of them seems to really take seriously the history and philosophy of the intellectuals in that context. So unless you actually try to do the work, and then you can worry about this, working out how do we disentangle the colonial legacy and the indigenous epistemology and so forth, right? So, but I don't think it's a time for us to worry about that question at this moment. There's more basic homework that needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mani, we've got some questions, two questions basically for you. One from Damien. Could you talk to the first question? This problem focus inquiry is particularly an issue in disability. Could growth be an alternative conception?
I'm not actually sure what the question is. So is Damien able to put their mic on? And
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, look, I'm just interested that that in the disability area, not acknowledging any that there is a problem at all can also be a denial of disability. But at the same time, the idea of people's opportunity for growth doesn't necessarily have to take a problem focus. I'm just wondering if recognizing difference and accepting that that we could all learn through difference could be an alternative conception than problem, saying that a problem-focused issue is alternative, is completely negative.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. And I would revisit the idea that it's not about not naming particular sites of disadvantage, of oppression, of systemic lacking of resources. In fact, it's actually designed to do the opposite. It's designed to create environment of change, but it's through the voices of the lived experience of those people and through the strengths of those people that are experiencing sites of oppression or disadvantage. So I certainly wouldn't say it's not about naming it, and I do think that it is an alternative way of approaching visibility, I suppose. And that's the richness of the philosophy. And what would be considered a practice in some areas. I know as a practitioner in my youth work, so I used to do casework with young people that had experienced school exclusion in mainstream school settings. So I used it with individual work that I was doing with young people. I used it in group work. I used it as a teacher. And now I'm using it as a researcher. So I think there's a lot of depth to it. And that's why I've invested quite a lot of thinking about it as a philosophy and potentially as a research theory.
we have a question from Nina. It's about sharing links, Marnie. So
yes, thanks,
yeah.
Maksud. I do know Julie, and I'm catching up with Julie soon. So
yeah. Thanks very much. We have a question for Daniel as well. It's from Kaylee. Daniel, thank you for your thoughtful and kind presentation. What would you say about the possible risk of interdisciplinary of being seen as a jack of all methodological and theoretical traits?
Thank you, Kyle. That's a really good question. I think, yeah, there is a risk of that if you're going to go out and learn 1,000 different things and there's no common thread to them. So I do think there needs to be a common thread. So it has been really hard in such a short time to talk about all the things that I've been doing, but all of these projects that I've done, so I've done some stuff that touches into public health. I did this placement at the CSIRO where I was working with, in this area of hydrology, and then obviously the language education research I do, but certainly what's underpinned it, there is a common thread to it. So I think you still need to make sure there's a common thread. The public health research I do is looking at multilingualism and how we communicate public health stuff with multilingual communities. When I was at the CSIRO, I was looking at social and cultural norms, and a lot of that actually involved looking at Indigenous theories that had informed water management. So that was something that, and I'd worked with decolonial theory. So there was a lot of overlap there. And then obviously my PhD research is in languages. So I think there needs to be a common thread. You're not going to go out and probably do something that's totally unrelated to anything you do, although you could. But I think, as you've mentioned there would be a risk that, it's going to be hard to bring it all together. So you want to look at ways you can bring your expertise to new areas, I think, when we're looking at doing transdisciplinary stuff as well. So I hope that's answered your question, but I guess my advice would be, try and find some kind of common thread with it. You don't want to not be able to relate things to each other.
Thanks, Daniel. There's a question from Raf as well. So what one piece of practical advice you can give everyone on how to manage the immensity of the task of being and becoming an academic in our current context?
Oh, one piece of advice. Gosh, that's a really tricky question. I think it would be different for everyone. It depends how you work. I know for me, I love a timeline and being really, really organized. So yeah, I guess that's something that's worked really well for me, and chunking my work. So I think we're all, this is probably stuff most people are doing. And really keeping yourself on time and on task with things and not taking on too much. I know it sounds like I've done a lot, and I have, but I've also had periods where I've really cut back my teaching, and I've just had to bite the bullet and accept that I'm not going to have a lot of disposable income for a while, because otherwise, if I were doing more teaching, I just wouldn't have had time for these other things that I did feel were really important. So I guess if you have the luxury of doing that, or if there's any way you can manage that, then certainly trying to look at ways that you can reduce other things that you might have commitments to. But otherwise, it's really, for me, all of the work that I ended up doing and all of these interdisciplinary connections and projects came from one conference that I attended back in 2019, where I met just a bunch of people, and they've invited me to do so many things. So I think the importance of building relationships through networking, and genuine relationships, not just I want to work with you, but people that you genuinely get along with as well. I think for me, these people that I network with, they're on one particular project. They're both located in Europe, and we usually meet once every couple of weeks. And I think 3/4 of the time we're just talking and catching up and chatting. So networking, but building genuine relationships and friendships with people you like and get along with and have similar interests with is probably what's been the most fruitful for me, because you will just naturally find things that you want to work on together, and you'll enjoy doing it. So it won't feel like such a drag when sometimes it is late at night and it takes a lot of time.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Looks like we have been very good with the time management.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Professor Kija Takayama, Dr. Marnie and Daniel Hendricks for their excellent presentations. I would also like to thank everyone once again for joining this keynote session today. Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference. With this, I end the session here, and I leave it to Pretty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maksud, and to all our distinguished speakers. What an amazing morning session it was. So now, before we break up for the morning tea, I will just quickly run through the conference etiquette. And most importantly, to all the chairs of the parallel session to please see that you provide the co-hosting rights to the participants. I will see you back in 15 minutes and enjoy your morning break. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.